History in print. Every story you're about to hear is real.
Good evening, this is History in Print. Tonight, Columbia, South Carolina, the year is 1877. The war had been over for 12 years, but in South Carolina, the evidence of it was still everywhere you looked. Burnt foundations where buildings once stood, fields that had gone to seed and not come back. A State House dome visible above the rooftops, scarred by artillery fire that no one had yet seen fit to repair. Horse-drawn wagons moved slowly through dirt streets. Church bells marked the hours. Wood smoke hung low in the winter air. This was a city in the long, uncertain middle of rebuilding. Federal troops had occupied South Carolina for over a decade. Now, in 1877, they were leaving. What came next? Who would hold power? Who would be heard? Who would be forgotten? That was still being decided. In the towns and counties across the state, ordinary life pressed forward anyway. Fairs were held, businesses opened, children were born, children died, and the local newspapers recorded all of it. The grand and the small, in equal measure. It is in those papers that this story lives. In the autumn of 1879, the Daily Herald Bulletin of Newberry, South Carolina, printed the life of a community in full. A county fair in its second year, rifle teams, a 6-year-old girl with a silk quilt, a postcard no one could read. Each one a window, each one real. Newberry County in the autumn of 1879 was a place that wanted to believe in itself. The second annual fair was proof of that. Farmers and townspeople gathering on dusty grounds to show what the county could produce, what its children could stitch, what its riflemen could hit. It was aspirational. It was community. It was also a little chaotic. The Daily Herald Bulletin covered the fair closely, and what its reporters found was a county fair in full human contradiction. On one end of the grounds, there were the gamblers. The paper noted with pointed disapproval that the fellows who ran, and here the record quotes directly, the high die, chuck-a-luck, wheel of fortune were operating openly. Not in back rooms, not after dark, openly. The column breaks off before the editors finish their condemnation. Whether that was the compositor's fault or the law's indifference, the record does not say. What it does say is that the games spun freely and no one stopped them. What the papers didn't print was any account of an arrest. The authorities, it seems, either could not or chose not to act. Inside the exhibition hall, a different kind of disorder had taken hold. The official wine judging committee, men appointed to evaluate the county's finest homemade vintages, had gathered around their table of bottles. They had their authority. They had their prestige. They did not have a corkscrew. The Herald Bulletin reported the rescue with barely concealed amusement. A newspaper editor, almost certainly the very man writing the account, produced one from his pocket. The paper described it as the kind he uses on paregoric bottles. For his trouble, the committee rewarded him with what the paper called a thimble full of blackberry wine. He opened the bottles. He received a thimble. Meanwhile, on the Fairgrounds, the Monroe rifle team had performed brilliantly the day before. Marksmen J.A. Cromer, F. Brooks, those Hutchinson, and A. Willingham each broke 11 of 12 targets. The Herald called the result splendid. Among the exhibits inside, a 6-year-old girl's patchwork silk quilt, entry number 549, drew particular admiration from the crowd, a county showing its best. And its most human. Inside the exhibition hall, the noise of the fairgrounds fell away. Tall windows let in the October light. Tables stretched the length of the room, covered in quilts, lacework, and handmade rugs. Women in long dresses leaned close, examining stitches too fine to see from a distance. Here, away from the livestock pens and the shooting ranges, another kind of achievement was on display. Not the achievement of industry or agriculture, the achievement of patience, of hands at work in quiet rooms. Among all the entries that week, one drew the attention of the press above the rest. Entry number 549, a patchwork quilt of silk. The reporter for the Daily Herald Bulletin described it as particularly noticeable. The child who made it was 6 years old. No name was given. The record does not tell us who she was. But she had made a silk quilt, by hand, before she was old enough to read with ease. And Newberry noticed. She was not alone in drawing a crowd. A pillow sham featuring thread lace insertion, worked with 25 bobbins, caught the eye of passers-by. A 14-year-old had produced lacework that rivaled the efforts of grown women. And a homemade rug, whose material, the reporter confessed, he could not ascertain, left him noting only that the labor invested was, in his word, wonderful. What the papers didn't print was the name of a single one of these makers. The boy with the rifle, the man with the prize steer, their names filled the columns. The girl with the silk quilt did not earn one line of identification. The city moved on. And then, set quietly among the fair coverage between shooting scores and agricultural notes, came a brief notice. The infant child of Mr. and Mrs. J.H. Goree of Newberry County had died. The child was 6 months and 14 days old. The cause was listed as congestion. The paper offered no name, no eulogy, just a line. A life recorded the way weather is recorded. Somewhere in Newberry County that week, a family grieved. The fair continued around them. On the morning of Tuesday, October 21st, a group of men gathered in an open field on the edge of Newberry County. They were the Monroe Rifle Team, marksmen preparing for competition at the second annual fair. Their names were known in the county: J.A. Cromer, F. Brooks, Thomas Hutchinson, A. Willingham, men who had likely spent years behind a rifle. That morning they intended to prove it. Clay targets were set, the line was taken, and when the practice concluded, each of those 4 men had broken 11 of 12 targets. The Daily Herald Bulletin called the result splendid. George Feltman, W. Keat, and J.M.H. Ruff each broke 10. Even the alternates, Willie Suber and D. Hutchinson, posted scores of 9 and 8 respectively. These were not men who missed often. The paper expressed hope they would do as well at the fair, where a prize was waiting. Whether they won that prize, the record does not say. Around the same time, a different kind of puzzle arrived at the Newberry post office. A postal card had come in bearing what could only be described as a mystery. The superscription read 110 So persévère cert ravet he lac. Postal workers stared at it. No one could make sense of it. The man who finally solved it was a Mr. Boone.
Every word you just heard came from the original newspapers. Subscribe to History in Print, a new story from the American